a trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the show. My fellow wrong thinker. No, wear that label with pride. I'm not calling you names. I'm not putting you down. I'm not trying to pigeonhole you into a particular corner. I want you to know that this program exists for the purpose of helping you see through the official smokescreen that is intended to keep us from knowing the world as it really is, as well as living our lives in the most productive way that we can choose to live them. And that takes full-time effort. So, first of all, I got to tip my hat to you. That's good for you for being willing to break out of the matrix and be red-pilled. Of course, you probably already are red-pilled, or you wouldn't even be considering this. But nonetheless, come find courage, come find camaraderie with your fellow wrong-thinkers, and let's all resolve to live the kind of life that we were born to live. Got some great stuff to share with you today. It's made possible by sponsors like MonticelloCollege.org, SewingAndQuiltingCenter.com, HSLAmmo.com, the Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage, and LifesavingFood.com. Thought we could start today with the push for accountability for those who inflicted lockdowns on us. There's a lot of talk about this, and I guess this may explain part of the shift that we're seeing in many members of the political class. Some of them just, coming around to, it's a good idea if we go ahead and lift some of these mask mandates or vax mandates or other lockdown things, dining bans or gathering bans. Yeah, there's a lot of people seeing the light here lately. Gee, I wonder what it could be. Someone pointed out yesterday, who knew? The cure for coronavirus was the president's approval rating dropping below 40%. Ha! But it sure looks like there are some political goals that are definitely at stake. The public is getting fed up. And I think the worst part for me is that the people who really actively pushed for lockdowns, for mandates, for all of the failed COVID-19 policies. And when I say failed, I'm not talking about, they weren't even trying to do anything good. I'm talking about they did things that had little to no effect. The only effect that I've seen on mortality, it may have saved some lives, all of that lockdown and destruction of businesses and personal lives and the toll on mental health. If it had any effect at all, and this is just according to one study, you're talking in the neighborhood of 0.2%. Well, but Brian, how can we put a price on that? Well, that's the lives saved. Now, look at the lives destroyed, and you'll see that the balance is way off, and that's the problem. How do you hold people accountable for this kind of thing? Because the very same people who pushed this endlessly, not just the people at the very top of the food chain, and I'm sorry, for Trump fans, this is going to be hard to hear, but Donald Trump was a big part of the problem because he first embraced the lockdowns. He deferred to Dr. Anthony Fauci. He was all in on vaccines, and by some accounts still is, talking about the miracle that occurred on my watch and, getting the vaccines out there. So how do you hold these people accountable? They clearly see that there's a great deal of anger beginning to build as people realize all of the sacrifices that were demanded of us, enforced upon us, were for naught. They were unnecessary. And it would be one thing if you could say, but no one really understood and nobody even warned us. I mean, how could we have known? This is just one of those things that happens. But it's not. There were many voices out there that were warning about what was happening and how this was being used to take advantage of an unknown or at least a novel virus, and whatever uncertainty there was, taking people's freedoms away, destroying their business to do, or their ability to do business with one another. That didn't solve the thing. Now you start to see some of these folks backpedaling. Well, we never really were for lockdowns. In fact, I think the president's press secretary, Jen Psaki, was trying to make that case earlier this week. Well, lockdowns were really a feature of the previous administration. Oh, they're trying to duck responsibility so badly. And, of course, this percolates on down to the state and to the local level. I mean, there are people who have very good reason to hang their heads in shame. And it would be very refreshing to see some of them at least say, you know what? I was wrong. I was totally wrong. I am so sorry. Here is my resignation. I will be stepping down from public service. But you don't see that. And I don't think these people perceive the degree of anger that is developing against them. I'm not saying that a lynch mob is coming to drag them out into the streets and settle the score. But some accountability would be a nice thing. And I think it would be the just thing to do. The question now is, will people like, and I'm just going to throw out there, for instance, California Governor Gavin Newsom. Do you think he's going to, acquiesce? I mean, not Pierre, sorry. I just named his dad. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, he's acting like Nicholas Ceausescu. Maybe he would be wise to consider how the Ceausescu saga ended back on Christmas Day, 1989. It was not a happy ending. But it seems like they're just inclined to double down and, we're gonna clamp down harder and we may lift some of these restrictions, but, the mask mandates stay for the kids. Why the kids? John Miltimore from the Foundation for Economic Education pointed this out. Why is it, with all these different mandates being listed, there are people still insisting, but the kids in school have to be masked? Why would they do that? Why would they keep them on the kids? And Miltimore says, because the kids are the hostages. Ooh, I know. You look at it in those terms and it's like, that's kind of chilling. See, I don't think the people who are in authority, the ruling class, I don't think they quite comprehend how angry the masses are becoming. And they're very fortunate. To this point, things have been pretty peaceful. And I hope they stay that way. But I have to really wonder what is going to happen when it comes to, the pushing for this. Actually, I'll be sharing this in the next hour, but there is an international group of lawyers that's come together and convened a grand jury for crimes against humanity in the name of COVID-19. You'll be interested to hear some of the names and some of the people that they will be, some of the names of who are involved, and also some of the people that they're going to be investigating and possibly indicting. It's an interesting time. And there's a fair amount of risk, not just for, the people in power who pushed these kinds of policies, but actually for all of us. So I hope you'll understand what I'm saying. I'm hopefully not ginning up more of that anger or telling you ought to feel angry too. I'm trying to point it out and to the best of my ability, encourage people. This is a time to proceed with great caution, if only because the emotions are running so high. And it may be tempting. I told you how I've struggled with, wanting to say, I told you so. But really, we can't do that. We really can't do that. People whose eyes are starting to open don't need to feel our wrath or feel condemned because you were dumb enough to go along with this. They don't need that. Their eyes are starting to open. They're starting to realize we all got played. They're taking their first tentative steps towards changing their perspective. And this is a time to encourage them to continue that journey, even though it's going to be painful. This is ripping off the Band-Aid from a particularly painful scar. But it's something they have to agree to do or have to want to do on their own. And I think it behooves us, and by us, I mean the ones who are on the side of freedom, the ones who are on the side of respecting everyone's God-given rights. We got to be very careful about the methods that we're using. Anger and vengeance cannot be our driving dynamics. They just can't. Unless we want to, see French Revolution 2.0. I don't think we want to see that. I think it would unleash terrible things not only on the people deemed responsible, but it would release unspeakable things on all of us. Now, having said that, I do believe that the people responsible need to be held responsible. I think they should be held criminally responsible. Separated from power, never allowed to participate in any type of authority whatsoever. I know, a guy can dream, but I also want to sound that note of caution. It's okay to feel angry. We all should feel a little bit angry, but don't wallow in it. Don't marinate in it. Let's take this in a productive direction. We'll be back in just a moment.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Welcome back to the show. Our program is brought to you by great sponsors like lifesavingfood.com. If you click on the link that I provide in my show notes, you will find it takes you directly to their website. And there is so much in terms of the kinds of food storage programs you can choose from. You want an individual, like a bucket. These are buckets that are, food that's sealed up and ready to go. It'll store for 25 years if you do your part. In other words, don't set it out in the trunk of your car and leave it in the hot sun, but 25-year shelf life. You can do the grab-and-go buckets. You can do a whole full year's supply if you want to. It's all up to you. From the beginner to the very experienced preparedness individual, you will feel much more peace of mind in knowing that you have something set aside for a rainy day. In fact, you'll feel great if you can create the equivalent of a small grocery store in your own home. Go to lifesavingfood.com, see how it's done. They'll give you 20% off. They'll give you no sales tax and free delivery. Some nice incentive right there. Well, the push for accountability on the people who inflicted the lockdowns on us has begun, but Jordan Schachtel is wondering, what will the next crisis look like? And I think he's got a good point here. Because with COVID mania getting stale, the ruling class needs another distraction. What's it going to be? Climate emergency? Cyber pandemic? War with Russia? I mean, it really seems like all of those things are on the table right now. After 2 years of robbing billions of people across the world of their lives and livelihoods, Jordan Schachtel writes, it seems the global ruling class has decided to roll back their prized biomedical security state. As these monsters try to wipe their hands clean of the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century. He says, we must remain vigilant about the possibility that they will attempt to seamlessly pivot to the next crisis. That's in quotation marks. Far from accepting blame over their failures, this ruling class is gaslighting us with declarations of victory over a virus. Just as an aside, there is that kind of sense of, well, as we lift these restrictions, it's almost as if, we heard your cries and we're here to save you. Don't fall for it. Jordan Schachtel says, using data manipulation and outright falsehoods, these failed leaders want us to thank them for saving us from a virus. But the stats couldn't be more clear. COVID season peaked the past 2 years in late January, with or without mRNA shots, with or without lockdowns, with or without masks, or whichever nonsensical restriction they forced into action. We saw the same results. Nowhere in the country did any of these restrictions prove to have any benefit whatsoever. 2 years of cures, supposed expert measures, and the like proved nothing but a giant sunk cost. We got scammed by Big Pharma, and much more importantly, we were unjustly robbed of our inalienable rights. And his point is the people in charge did nothing but contribute harm. Their public health measures only created a massive problem on top of the virus issue. First, it was the infamous 2 weeks to slow the spread. which turned into the endless rolling restrictions on human movement, the adoption of a new cloth mask-wearing religion, a biosecurity state segregation system, and the creation of a new mammoth-sized industry which produces nothing but pure snake oil that turned in record profits thanks to the safety regime. Schachtel says over the last 2 years in the United States, our government waged both an anti-humanitarian and an economic war on American citizens. Now, on the federal level, the United States recklessly printed trillions of dollars, devaluing the wealth of the vast majority of its citizens while enriching the connected elite. The Biden regime set the Constitution on fire and demonized those who refused to comply with their autocratic demands, labeling detractors as enemies who were on the side of a virus. On the state level, power-drunk governors made the lives of their citizens a living hell, destroying the hopes and dreams of millions of entrepreneurs, while forcing the working class to undergo an endless series of experimental injections in order to continue to feed their families. On the local level, school boards and academic institutions turned education into a prison sentence, using children as human shields to advance their political ideology. Schachtel says there's so much more to be said about this era, and the COVID mania era has left us with a rogues gallery of human rights criminals. Throughout the world, however, the people who have presided over the catastrophe would rather we stop talking about it as soon as possible, especially in the United States. You can imagine why, right? In America, the people in charge are looking for a distraction. And this is where Schachtel warns that distraction could come in many forms, perhaps a war with a great power, or a coming climate crisis, or even a cyber pandemic. That's one that they've been kind of wargaming themselves, so, I'd watch out for that. The list of possibilities is endless, and he says it's important to remain vigilant about what they might throw at us next. Now, keep in mind, midterm elections are just months away in the United States. And now COVID mania is deeply unpopular. I mean, the science didn't change, but the polls did. Politicians and the experts are trying to pretend they didn't steal 2 years of our lives with nothing to show for it. Their lack of remorse and honesty shows definitively that all they care about is staying in power and will do anything to remain in charge. Now, he says, I hope to see the day that Anthony Fauci and Xi Jinping and also Bill Gates and Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, and this long roster of evildoers are legally held accountable for their incredible crimes against humanity. But he says, for now, it's time to remain on the lookout for the next trick coming out of their sleeves. I get it. For some people, that's going to sound, okay, it's really paranoid, another conspiracy that they're just going to gin something up. But keep in mind, there are people, and I think there's ample evidence to point to, governing by crisis. Look, we all know people who thrive on crisis in their lives, or at least people who always seem to be in a constant state of crisis. We go from one crisis to the next, to the next, to the next. Politicians are no different. And in a rare moment of brutal honesty, do you recall when I think it was President Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, said the quiet part out loud and said, well, you never let a good crisis go to waste. They understand crisis is the key to keeping the people in line. That's, the equivalent of yanking our leash. Hey, something scary's happening. You need to remember why you need us. I was talking with a neighbor last night. And, we weren't trying to sit there and scare each other, but just commenting on, the rising costs of everything. He happens to be a builder. And so he's seeing this in ways that the rest of us might not encounter. The costs of lumber. Holy smokes. It's really something. But everything's getting more expensive. And as we see inflation, continuing to rise, and there's economic uncertainty, and there's the possibility of, war with Russia. There's, again, natural disasters, to contend with. There are a lot of things in commotion right now. If only there was some book that could tell us about why this might be so, or how this fits into a greater plan somehow. If only. All right, sarcasm off. But the bottom line is that there really is a lot that is very unstable at this moment. Now, I don't mean to focus on the instability, just merely to point out that, look, we all see it. We all feel it. I can't think of a single person, regardless of their inclination, whether they, consider themselves liberal, conservative, or somewhere in between, who doesn't look around and go, whew, this is messed up. Well, there's a lot we don't have control over, but the one thing that we do have absolute control over is what kind of individual we are going to be. And if tough times come, it may sound strange, but being a good individual makes the right kind of difference.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
And just like that, we are back. Okay, I don't want to sound too cynical, but isn't it curious how the science has suddenly changed in the space of a couple of weeks? Remember when we were told the science is settled? Masks work, social distancing works, vaccines work, all to slow the roll of COVID. And I'm not trying to make light of anything here, but I get the impression that we're supposed to just take these talking points from mainstream media outlets as if we were so many children being spoon-fed what to think by our supervisors. It's a little bit disgusting. But one of the things that I can't help but notice, and many other people are beginning to point out as well, isn't it amazing how the cure for COVID was apparently related to low approval ratings for the lockdowners? Got a great article here. This was published on zerohedge.com. It was originally published on QTR's Fringe Finance. I believe that's Quoth the Raven. Quoth the Raven says, I started out 2022 by predicting that capitalism and common sense would catalyze a massive pivot in how the mainstream media reports on COVID. I believed that the media would eventually start the process of pivoting from the hysteria and that politicians, understanding full well that they can't get reelected during midterms this year on a platform of locking people in their homes, would follow. And at this point, he says, all I can say 1 month into the year is, holy crap, does it look like I was right. So far in 2022, innumerable U.S. states, in addition to countries like Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, are lifting COVID restrictions. Connecticut and Delaware are planning on lifting school mask mandates by the end of March. Oregon officials have also announced that general mask mandates would be lifted March 31st. Even New Jersey and California announced that they would ease mandates in the coming weeks. And the media narrative has changed very quickly, too. Dr. Leanna Wen, columnist with the Washington Post and CNN medical analyst who has in the past gushed nonstop about following the government's COVID guidance, has now completely changed her appearance or her playbook for her appearances on CNN. In fact, on Monday of this week, she told CNN there was and is a time and place for pandemic restrictions. But when they were put in, it was always with the understanding that they would be removed as soon as we can. And in this case, the circumstances have changed. Case counts are declining. Also, the science has changed. The responsibility should shift from a government mandate imposed from the state or the local district of the school. It would shift to an individual responsibility by the family, who can still decide that their child can wear a mask if needed. Well, isn't that convenient? The science has changed. Now, in addition to sounding like she was erring on the side of freedom of choice, a concept Democrats now may only be conveniently adopting ahead of midterms, she also took to Twitter to represent the other side of the COVID argument that days ago would have been written off as conspiracy theory. So Tuesday night, she tweeted, "It can both be true, both that COVID-19 causes illness and harm, and also that its continued prioritization to the exclusion of other issues does too. It can both be true that masks reduce respiratory infections and also that they can have unintended harms. We must have an honest conversation about masking in schools. Two things can be true at once. Masks work to reduce transmission and they could cause harm to kids, especially young learners. There needs to be an ongoing risk-benefit analysis as there is for any intervention. And she also retweeted this statement from David Rubin, policy director at CHOP. This is a moment, to start removing the restrictions that have been placed on kids because the risk to their mental health, learning loss, those types of things are now far greater than the virus itself. Well, she's right. We need to have an honest conversation. But the question is, why are we having it now, and why weren't we allowed to have it just a few weeks ago? In fact, where the blank was this woman 6 months ago? On New Year's, she was urging people to mask up while heading outdoors to watch the ball drop. Quote, make sure you're vaccinated and boosted. Make sure that you're wearing a mask even though it's outdoors. There were lots of people packed around you wearing a 3-ply surgical mask. Now, in spring of last year, she was expressing fears about the U.S. not being able to reach herd immunity. In summer of last year, she was spreading the narrative, we can't trust the unvaccinated. Heading into fall, she was writing op-eds called Why COVID-19 Vaccines Should Be Required for All Americans. And now, only now that millions of vaccines have been distributed and the public's trust in the president and his COVID response is at all-time lows, she has completely and totally changed her tune. I know, it kind of seems convenient. The left is also starting to talk about concepts they were completely silent on for the past 2 years, most notably natural immunity. Quoth the Raven says it was less than a month ago that I wrote a piece arguing why I thought capitalism and common sense would end vaccine mandates in 2022. As part of that article, he says, I wrote that natural immunity would soon have to be a talking point due to Omicron potentially acting as nature's vaccine. This is a quote from that article. First, after this Omicron wave passes, it should hopefully stir up a discussion about natural immunity that's 18 months overdue. Putting vaccine mandates aside, Omicron, given its extremely infectious nature and mild effects, may wind up acting like nature's vaccine for almost everybody anyway. People will start to understand this concept and push harder on the science as to why it has been conveniently ignoring the topic of natural immunity, which has proven to be more robust than vaccination so far. And lo and behold, as The Hill pointed out this week, the CDC is all of a sudden starting to talk about natural immunity. A report published by the CDC on January 28th of this year finally acknowledges what many have suspected for a long time, that surviving COVID-19 provides excellent natural immunity and not only from repeat infection, but also to hospitalization and death for the Delta variant of COVID-19. So once again, we're asking, where was this analysis during that Soviet-style campaign to roll out vaccines through the country over the last 12 months? Now we're seeing articles like this. Here's the headline: How Omicron Upended What We Thought We Knew About Natural Immunity. But Quoth the Raven says, we've known about the robust immunity provided by natural immunity for months already. Studies in mid-2021 were showing durable and robust immunity from natural immunity. According to a large collection of data and trials by Dr. Larry Istrail in his post, COVID-19 Natural Immunity, a deep dive, studies dating back to 2020 continued to confer that natural immunity against COVID was effective. And there's a link to that comprehensive collection of sources, which is worth examining more closely, not the least of which is Dr. Fauci's own email exchanges from the inception of the panic in March of 2020. Now, even Senator Rand Paul was exasperated when he called the administration out for their odd penchant of not mentioning anything involving natural immunity. Speaking about Fauci's constant media appearances, Rand Paul said in fall of 2021, hey, this guy, Fauci, has an opinion on baseball, hockey, Tinder, and Christmas. But he was asked the other day about natural immunity that you acquire after COVID-19. And he's like, oh, really? That is an interesting thought. I never thought about that. I don't have an opinion because I haven't thought about naturally acquired immunity. And Rand Paul said, well, he has, and he is lying to you. The reason he won't bring up natural immunity is because it foils his plans to get everybody possible vaccinated. He thinks it might slow down vaccination. And I'm for people getting vaccinated, particularly people at risk. But the thing is, if you ignore naturally acquired immunity, then you're saying we don't have enough people. You have to force it on younger people. Now, Quoth the Raven says, what then may have seemed more of a conspiracy theory that Fauci was purposely ducking the question of natural immunity, today starts to look like the most realistic scenario. And from here, he goes into the Freedom of Information Act email from Fauci in early 2020. We know it was on his mind as soon as the pandemic started. That begs the question of why we were so silent about natural immunity for so long. Now, this article goes on. I'm going to let you discover the rest of it. I mean, it's a pretty lengthy write-up. But the one question that remains about the entire narrative, and now this pivot, is what was it all for? Was it to get the world vaccinated? And here Quoth the Raven says, well, forgive me if I'm skeptical. So, I hope you find it interesting. There's a wealth of information in this. You could spend the rest of the weekend just simply following all the different links contained in this particular article. And you'll find it in my show notes at thebryanhydeshow.com. If you want to subscribe, click the subscribe button, and I will put a copy of my show notes in your email inbox every single day that I do this program. What about that pivot? Do you think it's just connected to the desire to stay in power? Am I cynical for suggesting? Heck yeah, that's exactly the reason.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. A shout out now for sewingandquiltingcenter.com. This is a wonderful family-owned business in St. George, Utah. Been in operation since 1984. Teresa and Eric Alsop are the current owners, and they are wonderful people in and of themselves. But if you or someone you know is into, let's just say, quilting, do you know they sell and service handy quilter long arm quilting machines? I mean, if you remember the days when Grandma and the ladies would get together and they would quilt and everything was stitched by hand and had to be oh so precise, I mean, it's quite a thing. My mom is someone who has made a lot of quilts in her lifetime, and this is kind of a legacy thing. You know, to have one of Grandma's quilts, that is quite an honor. But if you're interested in quilting, if you just want to get sewing machines, if you're looking for embroidery, sewingandquiltingcenter.com. Click on that link, and you will see that they have all the supplies. They have Cuddles fabric. They have the thread. They have the training to teach you how to use your sewing machine or your long-arm quilting machine to the greatest effect. And, of course, they service what they sell as well. Proud to have them as sponsors on the program. Well, if we're just supposed to take our talking points from the media, as if, we were so many little children, we would have a very, very distorted view of what was actually happening with the Canadian truckers. And there's a great piece here. This is Barry Weiss shared this on her Substack account. It's actually by Rupa I'm going to try this name once here. Subramanya. Rupa Subramanya. What the truckers want. And I've been a big advocate of the idea, if you really want to find out what's going on, you got to go to the source. Just to put it in perspective, a few years back when Ammon Bundy and others occupied the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, the press had a lot of things to say about that, about what they were doing, and was this domestic terrorism? There was a very concerted effort to try to paint this in one way and one way only. But by going to the source, which I fortunately had the opportunity of doing, we learned things were quite different than what was being reported in the media. Same thing here with the Canadian truckers. Rupa Subramanya says, for 2 weeks, the 18-wheelers, the semis, the tractors, the pickup trucks streamed through snow and ice into the center of Ottawa, the Canadian capital. They came from across the country, vaxxed unvaxxed, white, black, Chinese, Sikh, Indian, and alone, either with their wives or their kids or by themselves. They huddled around campfires. They set up pop-up kitchens and tents with block captains doling out coffee and blankets. They honked and honked and honked. They blasted "We Are the World," and everywhere you looked, someone was waving the maple leaf. It dipped to 4 degrees. The mayor declared a state of emergency, and they didn't budge. The truckers were scared of running out of gas, freezing to death in their little truck beds in the middle of the night. The city threatened to arrest anyone who brought it to them. And in response, hundreds of Ottawans did just that. The truckers stayed put. They are a city inside a city whose inhabitants, there are an estimated 8,000 to 10,000, were outraged with a country that seemed to have forgotten that they existed. This past Sunday, as if to confirm that suspicion, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has yet to meet with Freedom Convoy leaders, took a personal day. On Monday, during an emergency debate at the House of Commons, he called them "a few people shouting and waving swastikas." Now, the author says, look, I live in downtown Ottawa within view of Parliament Hill, and I've spent the past 10 days or so, bundled up and walking around the protests. I have spoken to close to 100 protesters, truckers, and other folks, and not one of them sounded like an insurrectionist, white supremacist, racist, or misogynist. See, this is the advantage of going to the source. And here, Rupa gives us a number of different examples of the people that he spoke to. They sound like Ivan, 46, who immigrated with his wife Tatiana from Ukraine to build a new life in New Brunswick in eastern Canada. "We came to Canada to be free, not slaves," he said. "We lived under communism, and in Canada, we're now fighting for our freedom." Like so many truckers, Ivan refused to share his last name. Probably a good idea, because the Canadian government is making lists right now. B.J. Dichter, a spokesman for the Freedom Convoy, is vaccinated. He estimates that many, maybe most of the truckers at the protest are too. He says, "I'm Jewish. I have family in mass graves in Europe, and apparently I'm a white supremacist." Now, ostensibly, that's tongue-in-cheek, by the way, ostensibly, the truckers are against a new rule mandating that when they re-enter Canada from the U.S., they have to be vaccinated. But that's not really it. The mandate is a moot point. The Americans have a similar requirement, and anyway, the vast majority of Canadian truckers, according to the Canadian Trucking Alliance, are vaccinated. CTA represents about 4,500 truckers nationwide. So it's about something else, or many things. A sense that things will never go back to normal. A sense that they're being ganged up on by the government, the media, big tech, big pharma. One thing was indisputable. The author says there was this electricity running through the streets, and it felt like it could get out of control. It didn't help when a handful of protesters sported swastikas and Confederate flags, or when GoFundMe shut down the convoy's fundraiser, announcing that donors had 2 weeks to reclaim their money before it was sent to established charities chosen by GoFundMe. Or when the cops started arresting locals, including the elderly. The author says it's really hard to capture how thoroughly Trudeau has misjudged the moment. "This pandemic has sucked for all Canadians," he said Monday. "As for the protest, it has to stop." Well, if he sauntered down to the mess of rigs on Wellington Street, across from the Parliament building, opposite the mall and the War Memorial, if he talked to these people for a few minutes, he would understand. It will not stop. What's happening in Canada right now is bigger than the mandates. The convoy is spearheaded by truckers, but its message of opposition to life under government control has brought onto the icy streets countless, once voiceless people declaring that they are done being ignored. That the elites, the people who have zoomed their way through the pandemic, better start paying attention to the fentanyl overdoses, the suicides, the crime, the despair, or else. Kamal Panu is 33 years old, a Sikh immigrant and trucker from Montreal. He doesn't believe in vaccinations. He believes in natural immunity. He joined the convoy because COVID restrictions in the surrounding province of Quebec had become too much to bear. He said that he and his wife used to do their grocery shopping at Costco until the government decreed that the unvaccinated would be barred from the big box stores. Since then, their monthly grocery bill had jumped by $200. Now, before he said we didn't look at the price of what we were buying. Now, sometimes we put items back because we don't have that much money. Peter is 28 years old, a long-haul trucker from Ontario. Peter told the author that a divide had opened up all across the country. Pointing to the gleaming, ritzy condominiums near Parliament, he said he used to deliver the concrete stairs in those buildings. Since the cross-border vaccine mandate kicked in mid-January, he's been out of work. He refused to get vaccinated, he said, because the whole thing had been so politicized and he couldn't be sure who to trust. Now, he refused to give his last name, he said, because he didn't want the government coming after him, and he wanted to work again. And the author says, I heard this over and over from the truckers, and it was not entirely crazy. The CTA, which has publicly criticized the Freedom Convoy, said in a January 29th statement addressed to the truckers in Ottawa, your behavior today will not only reflect upon you and your family, but the 300,000 plus fellow Canadians that, like you, take great pride in our industry. Now, if you point that out to people like Peter, and the author says, and I did, that almost every doctor in the country had been vaccinated, it didn't matter. There was bodily autonomy and privacy and religious exemptions. And anyway, how could you know what the doctors were thinking? You couldn't trust the press or politicians, he said, recalling that in the fall of 2020, then vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris expressed skepticism of any vaccine approved under President Donald Trump. Now they were being ordered to get this vaccine developed under President Donald Trump. Peter said if you're not vaccinated, they treat you like garbage lying on the streets. Now, there's a host of other people that the author talks to. But the solidarity was infectious. Copycat protests have popped up in Helsinki, Finland, and Wellington, New Zealand, and Nice, France. They plan to hit Paris and Brussels. Truckers are organizing in the Netherlands, Australia, even the United States. But this is a very different story than what you would get if you simply went by mainstream media outlets, many of whom don't even want to talk about the protest, and those who do talk about it in the same terms that Justin Trudeau talks about it. Why, it's just a bunch of racists and misogynists out there causing trouble for everybody. I think it's a good rule of thumb. When in doubt, go to the source. You'll have to check out the link I provide in today's show notes. You'll find it at thebryanhydeshow.com.
This is The Bryan Hyde Show.